At the time it hurt. I was embarrassed. I remember, I worked with a friend, and she was Black. She was at the same level that I was. We had to change the way that we interacted with each other when we were in this group. And I remember talking to her about it. But throughout my entire career, that is something. And I always share that with I share that story all the time. This was the first piece of feedback that really stung, and it really hurt. And it's affected how I interact with people. It's affected what I think about. It's affected me my entire career.
Hello, welcome to Act Inspired Behavior, the show about real people and their real stories of transformation and change told through the lens of acceptance and commitment therapy. I'm Gabby Lanier. Today is all about perspective taking and identifying the ways in which we develop a rigid self-identity. Our guest today is Danyelle Beal, a behavior analyst for more than 20 years. She will share her struggles and her successes, her identity as a Black woman, and how that journey has led her to become a leader and a mentor for other women of color in her field. This story is one that doesn't have a definite starting or ending point, because we are really talking about Danyelle's experience as a woman of color, and that experience continues to today. We are really going to dig into race issues here, primarily through her internal struggle, and then explore the outer context of racism and prejudice which is infused into her everyday life from the inside out. Though this story is unique to Danyelle, I found so many commonalities between her and myself as a mom, as a person of color, as a woman, as a person who has felt marginalized myself. And it especially speaks to me as a person who has struggled with anxiety for a majority of my life. It speaks to me because I too have a narrative and a story and an identity which is very much shaped and reinforced by the people around me, the people I grew up with, and my society and culture. So, as you listen in, see how you can relate to her story, even if your life looks totally different from hers. See how you can take her perspective, how you can see her story, and how that can impact the way you see yourself and your own narrative of who you are. And maybe it'll change the way you relate to yourself, give you more self-compassion, and perhaps it will even change the way you approach your fellow colleagues, your friends, your family, through the lens of equity and race. Welcome, Danyelle. Thank you for coming on and being willing to interview for this podcast. I'm so excited to have you here. How are you doing?
I'm good, Gabby. Thank you so much for having me. It's been really an exciting process getting to know you, and I'm excited to be here sharing parts of my story with you.
Awesome. Yeah, and I really appreciated that you reached out. Yeah, like you said, we've met a couple of times, and then you've gone through one of my workshops, and that was really nice, a nice way to get to know you. So I'd love for you to just go ahead and share with people who you are and what you do.
Okay. So my name is Danyelle Beal. I have been a board certified behavior analyst since 2014, but I've actually been working in the field of ABA for a little over 22 years now. To kind of go back a little, the reason why I reached out to you was because through all the events that have been going on lately in our world, I have recently found value in reaching out to other clinicians, which is something I've never done before in my career. And I really, as I kind of was looking through some of the work that you do, was really interested in how you were putting together information, and really wanted to learn more about ACT and get to know you as a clinician, and potentially just find a commonality so that, we could potentially work together, do some project together, which again is very new for me.
Yeah. So Danyelle has been in her field for the last 22 years. In this next part, she talks about how she started in the field of behavior analysis. She was 19, an undergraduate, and basically fell into this career path. In this next part, she talks about how she showed up on her first day with her very first client.
Very pregnant. I drove up to the woman's house, and as I was getting out of the car, the little boy was eloping. He was around 2. He was eloping from the house. The mom, started chasing him. The dog started chasing her, and she was like, "Stop him." And so I'm waddling very hugely after them.
Oh, geez.
um, which he had run into the middle of the street, and she had grabbed him, and she was like, grab his other arm. And we brought him back to his house, kicking and screaming. And as soon as we got there, she was like, you're hired.
From there, she talks about how she grew up in the field and how she became a technician on a single team. As time went on, her expertise grew and families were starting to request to work with her. She was also experiencing a lot of personal changes and internal struggles.
At that time, I had my daughter, and during that time, my mom had passed away, and I had adopted my then 11-year-old brother.
Danyelle, because of the way her job was structured, she was actually able to take her young daughter and brother with her to work as a way to provide interactions with typical peers to her clients. Over the years, Danyelle continued to develop and went from being a technician to a lead technician to a trainer, and then a supervisor on various teams, going from one company to the next. One thing she found was that others were starting to reach out to her for professional development and advice.
A lot of the clinicians would reach out to me for support, specifically Black and Brown clinicians. And this was the first time that I had kind of realized that they didn't have access to, other Black upper level staff.
Danyelle was eventually invited to go to another agency to become the clinical director and was there for a couple of years.
It was a really challenging position, and I was really in a boat by myself. And it was during this time that, the requirements to be certified to do the work that I do was really kind of hammering down on their regulations and their systems. And so I had finished my coursework and started trying to pass the exam, but was really stressed. I had a lot going on personally, and that job really had taken a lot out of, go ahead.
For a moment. And I want to come back to this moment you're just talking about right here. But so if someone off the street were to try to get to know you and who you are, and you were to kind of state who you are and what you do, you've kind of told us what you do. But what about like who you are? So if you were to describe, where you're from and just who you are in the world, what would you say?
So the very kind of basic answer would be that I'm a mom. Got pregnant my first semester in college and really lost and confused. And this was the first time I had thought about the kind of life that I wanted to live. I knew that if I didn't start thinking about what my life would look like, that I would end up like the environment that I grew up in. And so this is when I started kind of cultivating a path for me, because at that time I was confused, I was lost, and didn't really have any direction. And so I knew immediately that I had a passion for working with children. And I realized that passion came from the lack of resources that I had growing up. I realized that because I didn't have direction and support, and I wasn't taken care of in the way that I needed to be taken care of, that I really wanted to work with children to provide a support that I hadn't been able to access as a child. So that was kind of the first, I guess, awareness that I had about who I was and who I wanted to become. I wanted to be a caregiver. I wanted to be a caretaker. I wanted to be able to help children find their voices, because I struggled with finding my own.
Yeah.
I don't know if that answers part of your question.
I think it's helpful to just, introduce ourselves in that way, because, what from my own self, when I'm hearing you start to kind of unfold the events that kind of led you to where you are now. And I think about the fact that it's pretty remarkable that it sounds like you got pregnant when you were fairly young, right?
First semester in undergrad, I was 19.
Oh my gosh.
Can you imagine? My gosh.
No, I cannot imagine. Oh my goodness. I was pregnant in graduate school, so it kind of reminds me a little bit of that, but it was a different scenario altogether.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also really remarkable too that you basically stumbled upon this career path. And I mean, just you giving that image of of you showing up for your first therapy session and not really knowing what to expect. And the first thing you see is someone running down the street. I mean, that's pretty classic. So many people, I mean, who work in the field of behavior analysis have had similar experiences where you're just thinking to yourself, oh my gosh, how did I get here?
Yeah.
Did I choose this? And then you end up continuing to do it because it's good work, and you find your passion, and you find the reason you start something isn't necessarily the reason you stay. And then you find new reasons, new values that you connect to along the way that keep you there and that keep you motivated and maybe even push you farther into it and maybe a slightly different direction than you had originally intended. So I know when we were just talking about before we started this interview that you were interested in telling a story about your career path. How can you tell that story from your perspective, just as a woman of color navigating through a field that is predominantly, people who aren't of color, and who also serve a very diverse range of people? I'd love to know what your perspective is on that as you've had that experience. And you were kind of alluding to it just before I interrupted you.
That's okay.
You got to a point where, you'd been in the field several years. You are now required to go back to school and to get this certification. So what are some of the struggles that you faced as you went through that process of that moment in your career?
So kind of tying in the two parts, me being a woman of color, not really recognizing, early in my career, the disparity between me being African American and not having access to anyone who looked like me. And this question specifically about my perception about having to go back to school to gain access to, a more substantial career. So during the time that I was in school, so it took me 7 years to complete my undergrad because I had two children who were literally going to school with me. I was working all day, going to school until 10 o'clock at night. The first year that my brother was with me, I was actually commuting him from Long Beach to Victorville. My mom died in March, and I had to, he had to finish out the school year. So I was commuting. And it was a struggle. So it took me, 7 years to complete my undergrad. And I was like, okay, I'm done with school. Like, finally, it was a huge accomplishment. I was first generation college graduate. I was, breaking these kind of generational curses that, I call them generational curses that, had come up in my childhood, and I was breaking them and kind of forging a new path for my children. And I thought I was done. And then my agency said, hey, you're doing great work, but in order to keep the position that you are currently doing, which I was supervising school district kiddos, they were like, you have to have a master's degree. And the only reason I went back to school to obtain my master's at that time was because I wanted to continue the work that I was doing in the school district. So I did that. I finished that in 2 years. And then at the very end of that, it was like, hey, now it's required that you obtain this certification to continue the work that you're doing. I think I was able to do that, within a year after I had graduated my program.
Okay. I also find it really, really interesting too that you went through undergrad, graduate school, and I know now you're getting your PhD.
My PsyD, yes.
All while being a working mother.
Yes. Yes. A single working mother. In the midst of all this, Gabby, kind of going back, my mom died. I adopted my little brother. I was navigating this space in my career where I'm the only Black woman. I'm a single parent, which, I'm looking at all my colleagues who are young, they're, white. And I remember feeling like I was being judged because I was a single parent. I felt like I was, and if I shared some of my history, those themes have kind of always resurfaced in the way that I think about myself. So just to kind of go back a little bit, just to give you some perspective. Yeah. My mom is Mexican, she's of Hispanic descent, and she had 3 Black children who she had really difficult relationships with each of our fathers, and so she really had a hard time accepting Black people and Black men in particular. And so we were given the message that Black people were this and Black people were that, and I constantly always struggled with like my identity. Like when I looked in the mirror, I felt Black, I looked Black, and I was being given this message that, you know, that we were not worthy. And so, you know, we lived in poverty. You know, I was in and out of foster homes growing up, and we were on welfare, you know. And so as I'm growing up and trying to establish myself, I'm constantly trying to prove myself. And these are themes that are coming up in my working with people who are not Black, right? I'm working with superiors and coworkers, and I'm constantly battling these themes. You're worthless, Danyelle. You know, they're going to think this about you because Black people are this. You know, Black people are welfare recipients, and they're going to know these things about you, you know. And I'm constantly fighting these themes and these kind of issues that are coming up internally. And so I'm constantly working hard to prove myself. You know, they know I'm a single mother. They know that, you know, I have 2 children to take care of. I'm dragging them to meetings because I don't have babysitters. And, you know, so I'm constantly bringing them to the offices with me, and constantly, you know, just having to navigate their life, you know, as I'm a single working mother. And it really impacted the way my work ethic, you know, I didn't want to be considered less than, and I didn't want to be described, or, you know, I didn't want perceptions to come up about me. And so my work ethic kind of was that I overcompensated. I was usually the earliest one in. I was the last one to leave. I was the one to take really difficult cases. I was the one who was constantly, you know, asking people to, you know, give me opportunities and taking opportunities to volunteer. And because I really wanted them to see good in me. Like it was really this deep, deep, deep desire for them to recognize me and not to notice all the like quote bad things about me, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. Yeah. So just to repeat back what you're saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, like you were having thoughts around not feeling good enough, that you had these kind of preconceived notions about who you were that you didn't want other people to think. And so to kind of escape some of that, or to kind of relieve the pressure of that, your solution was to try harder, to do more, to be better,
overcompensate.
Yeah, that's interesting. And in ACT, they call these they talk about, you know, avoidance of difficult feelings.
Mm-hmm.
You engage in behavior that they call like control strategies. So ways to escape that, you know, that narrative, or those thoughts that make you feel really uncomfortable and insecure, or whatever the feeling is. And then those strategies might be, you know, maybe you don't do certain things, or you do certain things that actually make in the long term make it even harder. And actually it's not, kind of sounds like this kind of pattern too could possibly lead to that sense of burnout, which is pretty likely, especially for a person like you who has all these responsibilities, and to put this extra weight of responsibility of having to be even better, try even harder than everyone else around you. How, like, did you see yourself, like, what were some of those long-term kind of impacts on you, like in your personal life?
So you actually bring up a really good point, Gabby. I never realized the connection between why I was burnt out. That never dawned on me until this moment. It was, obviously I was exhausted. I had a lot going on, and just to like, let you know, my undergrad, I was enrolled in, like, I was going to Long Beach State. I was enrolled in city classes, and I was learning how to be a sign language interpreter. And so again, these themes of me overcompensating weren't just at work, trying to prove to people that I was, worthy, but also like my education. Like I put every waking moment into like bettering myself, to provide, opportunities, to jump into opportunities so that my children wouldn't suffer from, again, those generational curses. And I never made the connection that I was burnt out because I was spending so much time kind of running in this hamster wheel. And then fast forward to the time that I was the clinical director at this agency. And it was just, I can't even get into how challenging of a time that was. But my husband now, we're high school sweethearts. And so he's always been a big part of my life. But we went through a really bad breakup during this time. And I had lost the house that we had, and we had broken up, and I stopped working for this agency. And I remember I was so exhausted. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that occurred to me during this time was all of the work that I was kind of doing and putting into, I hadn't really started. I had never really dealt with the trauma that I had experienced, and I had never really dealt with some of these things that were coming up, and that I knew that I was kind of putting this pressure on myself, but it wasn't until that process that my therapist started kind of sharing with me, like she started teaching me, like, this is why you're feeling like this, because you have this insane, like basically what I was doing, and there's no other word that I can think of, was just overcompensating. You've not dealt with any of these things. And you're putting all of your energy into these things, and it's not leading to any effective healing. And once she kind of laid that out for me is when I started to really do the heart work of my healing and kind of taking control over my life and starting to kind of figure out a new way that I would function that didn't involve me kind of stuffing everything with education and opportunities and making money, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And I find it really interesting because I relate to what you're saying to a certain extent, with just this idea of you do more so that you can compensate for those, maybe those lack of skills or judgments that other people might have of you and how you're showing up. And then also there's this idea too, and let me know if this resonates with you, but for me, sometimes I'll say to myself, this is leading to XYZ. So once I work hard enough, I'll make enough money, or get to a place where I can then start to relax and enjoy the little things in life. Like I'll be able to spend more time with my kid. I'll be able to spend more time with my husband. We'll be able to do more fun things like on the weekends. And then those times never seem to come.
Yep.
Because once one obligation is fulfilled, the space that is made after that's done gets filled with other responsibilities.
Something else
on your plate.
Yeah. I'll share an example with you if I can. I was in finals, I had a lot going on, good stuff, but a lot going on, and I was completely overwhelmed. And so I remember saying, like, as soon as finals are over, like, I can breathe. As soon as the semester is over, I can breathe. And then as soon as it was over, we had a vacation, and I came back and I'm just slammed with stuff. And it's exactly as you said. I'm like, as soon as this is over, I can breathe, but that's not what happens. There's that space in your calendar and someone says, hey, how about this? And you're filling it in. Right. So yes, I can completely resonate with that thought.
Yeah. Yeah. I definitely recognize with that, with the urge to constantly rise to really super high level expectation of yourself that you think others have of you, but they probably don't.
Yeah.
Not to the same extent you do. So if you could go back in time and kind of go back to some of these moments where you really feel like you were overcompensating to kind of avoid this feeling of maybe not being enough in comparison to your colleagues. What would you say to yourself, or what would you tell yourself to give yourself time to do?
When I think back over my career, I feel really blessed to have served this field, to serve my profession all the years that I did. I think I shared with you, kind of in a personal conversation that we were having, that I have quietly been been engaged in service, right? Like that's kind of a passion of mine. And that's kind of one of my values is service. And I consider myself a servant leader. And so I've always been so proud of the work that I've done, but it's been quietly, and it's been in the trenches with my children and the parents and, my staff. And I never really looked up and gained access to other clinicians. And as I was coming up, I was screaming for attention, like, hey, notice me, look what I can do. Look what, how I've changed these behaviors. Look how I've motivated these staff. Look how I've taught these parents. But those were natural skills, Gabby. Those were things that I could do naturally. And although I had to learn, different things, I had to learn how to navigate difficult conversations, or I had to learn to become an effective supervisor. I learned by trial and error. And that was fairly easy because I had a natural skill set. But I really never, if I couldn't do something, I was never given the opportunity to learn how to do it. And so I wish that my supervisors and my colleagues I wish I would have really, because I take responsibility for, what I didn't get. I wish I would have had the thought that said, you know what, you can't do something, Danyelle, go seek someone who can and learn these skills. Because now at 42 years old, we're in a global pandemic, I am realizing for the first time in, really in my career, I'm a Black clinician, and a part of what I've been doing these past few years is really helping support other Black clinicians, RBTs, to become certified, new BCBAs. I provide mentorship, I provide coaching, and I've really been doing this, but really the thought never really struck me that I have met only one other Black BCBA, and missing that connection and because I never felt like I could go to a superior or to another peer and say, hey, I'm lacking in this area. Can you help me? And for the first time in my life, I'm realizing that I didn't have access to those things. That's what I wish I could change, is that I wish I could go back and say, hey, these are the things I'm not good at. How can I gain access to learning these skills? Because this is going to help you in the future, because now I feel like I'm at a huge deficit.
Yeah. And it's kind of like you are providing the kind of mentorship and
that I wanted. Yes.
Yes. And not only that, not only providing the mentorship, you physically represent them, and understand them in a way that a non-Black colleague just wouldn't understand. And you're actively seeking out those relationships because maybe they're in a place, and I can't speak for everyone, obviously, but maybe some of them are in a place where they don't feel like they have permission to ask for help, like you did. And you can tell them that, it's okay.
Yeah.
It's okay to ask for help.
Yeah. I'll give you an example. I was working for a really large company a couple years ago, and an RBT who was mid-level staff was really having a lot of challenges with her supervisor. And a lot of the clinicians at that time were just reaching out to me. Again, I was, one of the only I was the only Black staff who was upper level. And so she reached out to me, and she's like, I'm really struggling in these areas. And as I kind of looked at, her skill set, I had realized that she had never been trained, effectively. That she was put into a position that she had never been effectively trained for. And so the feedback that she was getting feedback because she lacked a skill set, because she wasn't taught that skill set. And so even though I wasn't her direct supervisor, had spent time kind of cultivating the skill set and had mentored her, within the organization, and she was able to develop this in about these certain skills in about 7 or 8 months. But a lot of it was just that she couldn't even fully articulate to a person who didn't look like her some of the challenges that she was facing, right? Because I have processing disorders myself. I can understand how someone struggles, with graphing. I can understand how someone struggles with report writing, let's say. And she wasn't being heard. And she recognized that immediately and shut down. But because she could access someone who looked like her, those walls were immediately kind of broken down, and she's able to kind of convey her thoughts, and I'm able to understand them because we share some of the same challenges, right? And we were only able to get to that point because we share the same skin color. And those are things that are so hard to talk about. They're so hard to describe to a person who's white. And it's hard to kind of for them to understand why that's so important. And as I look back on my career, I never had access to that. It's something that's really challenging to talk about. And because it's so hard to talk about, it's hard to know how to address it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think one of the things that maybe and can lack maybe on both sides is this perspective taking.
Yes.
And being able for a white colleague to put themselves in your shoes and to fully understand your perspective about how you might perceive your role, you know, and how hard it might be to admit that you don't know something or that you make a mistake, or that they might expect you to advocate for yourself in a certain way that
yes.
in these contexts aren't comfortable. And it reminds me of something my husband was saying, because he's a producer on a radio show, and the two hosts are two people of color. And he asked them once off air, he said, would you guys be able to have the same sorts of conversations, even on air, if your host partner were white? And they both automatically said no. That, you know, they do get into the topic of race, but they also talk about other things that are hard for them, that they just wouldn't be able to bring up in an atmosphere in which they were the minority.
Yes.
So,
yes.
And at the same time, I think we do get a lot of understanding the perspective of white folks, because maybe we're in a situation where we're the only person in the room who isn't white. I've been in that situation all the time. And so we put ourselves in their perspective a lot. And it's like you're able to do that, like code switching, you know. But
yeah.
So, I mean, what is one thing that you would like your white colleagues to maybe kind of those upper level supervisors, directors of an organization to know about their employees of color? Like what perspective do you wish they would take?
Before I answer that, I want to go back to your comment about learning how to advocate in a certain way. And then that code switching piece. So you bring up such an important part, and you're helping me kind of articulate my thoughts. And it reminds me of one of the first pieces of feedback that I was ever given in my career. It was with that first agency. I was the first employee that they had hired. And I remember, you know, just because of who I am, because of my culture, because of my background, this is my first real professional, job. And I'm advocating for myself, right? I'm advocating. I want to say at this time what my rate of pay would be at that time. And I'm coming across a certain way. And it's very, I guess, Black in culture, if I could say that. And it's all I know. And she stops me and she's like, Danyelle, I hear what you're saying, but you're going to have to learn to control that. You're coming off as a bulldog. And this is the feedback that was given to me. You're like a pit bull. And this is going to be good when you're advocating for families and, when you're fighting school districts, but you're going to have to learn to control that. And I remember feeling like she had just popped a balloon, because what she, and she told me, you come off as intimidating, you come off as angry. And these are labels that Black women have to deal with, right? These are labels that Black women are constantly having to defend and having to talk about and having to navigate. And that's kind of where that code switching comes. Like, I'm allowed to be this way in one environment, but I have to, wear this completely other hat in this environment. And I often joke, there's my nickname is Digga. There's Digga from Long Beach, and she's this way. And then there's Danyelle, from Eastvale, and she's this more professional kind of presence. And that's exhausting, Gabby. And I guess, to kind of lead into this question, what I wish that other colleagues would understand, and not even that they need to understand it immediately and that this is something that they should know, but having a conversation, right? Because at 19 and being told that I'm coming off as a pit bull was damaging, right? And I talked about kind of the things that I thought about myself and how it affected me professionally. Those are struggles that to this day at 42, 22 years into my career, I'm constantly thinking about. How am I coming across? How are people perceiving me? What do they think about me? I wish that conversations would be had to kind of alleviate some of the confusion that comes up with not understanding different cultures and not understanding why people are the way that they are. I think kind of putting people into this strictly, you have to come across this way is denying a huge part of who they are. And I don't think that needs to happen. I think that more effective relationships can happen and more effective collaborations can occur if conversations are had when there's any sort of confusion about how a person is coming across.
Yeah. And it's fascinating too, because it sounds like that conversation was a one-on-one conversation too, right?
No,
it was
in front of, it makes me emotional. I'm getting emotional thinking about it. It was in a room full of white peers and supervisors.
Oh, wow. I was imagining you talking to a supervisor one-on-one in a room privately, but having that said out loud, that's horrible.
And I don't know if you ever heard of this, but that the feedback sandwich, I'm going to say something nice, yeah, and then I'm going to give you the constructive feedback, and then I'm going to say something. And it was like, this skill is going to serve you in this capacity, but this is how you're coming off. Work on it. And right. And so, at the time it hurt. I was embarrassed. I remember, I worked with a friend, and she was Black. She was at the same level that I was. We had to change the way that we interacted with each other when we were in this group. And I remember talking to her about it. But throughout my entire career, that is something. And I always share that with I share that story all the time. This was the first piece of feedback that really stung, and it really hurt, and it's affected how I interact with people. It's affected what I think about. It's affected me my entire career.
So I want to pause a moment here and just point out a few things. This story that Danyelle just shared is really powerful and is a really good example of how a single moment can become an experience that is then folded into one's larger learning history. So when Danyelle was told she was being a bulldog or a pit bull, that she was behaving in a certain way, these new relations, these things that she learned, these words became solidified and reinforced into her memory. So let me just read out a couple of labels for you, a couple of words or concepts that can become related with one another into this kind of larger web of her learning history. So for example, bulldog, Black woman, intimidating, angry, you need to control that, and Danyelle. All of these words and relations are connected with one another now and can become part of this larger web. This actually harkens back to the science behind acceptance and commitment therapy, which is the science of human language and cognition. It's called relational frame theory. And what the science tells us is that we as humans, we learn, and it's this wonderful, beautiful thing that we do as humans, but it's also when we learn new things and we take those words, like the word bulldog, we relate them back to everything else we've ever learned. And so when Danyelle had this new experience, she took these new labels and reinforced it with the identity of who she was. And so when she looks at herself in the mirror, she may have heard some of these labels before in the past when describing Black folks or indirectly as descriptors of herself, but these labels were now directly reinforced with who she was as a person, as described by somebody else. Maybe a label that she didn't want to have. something she didn't want to be, this story that she then had to kind of fight against. And as her colleague said, she needed to control that. This taught her how to code switch, to act in a way that was opposite a bulldog, so that she could behave oppositely and be respected in her workplace as a fellow colleague. She recognized that the culture, the language, the standards, the ways in which she needed to interact with others in the field meant she had to act the way that everyone else was acting, which was within the context of white culture. And I really want you to think about this idea of looking in the mirror. How do we see ourselves right here, right now? How does that perspective change based on where we are physically and where we are in time? And this ability to take that perspective is with us at all times. It's just that sometimes we don't really see it that way. It's like when we look in the mirror, we see this person looking back at us, and we think that that person is always that person and it never changes. Same eye color, same hair color, but we also think that same way about the labels we have of ourselves, our identity, our personality. But that's not necessarily true, right? We're different people at work versus different people at home, and vice versa. And so I really want to point this out because this really exemplifies one of the processes of acceptance and commitment therapy, and it's called self as context. And when I think of self as context, what I think of is this ability to take that perspective on yourself, right? To step back from the larger picture and to see the context of your environment, to see where you are and how and your relation to that environment. Because your behavior, this is really key, it is a product of your environment, including the environment of your mind, of your learning history, of your memories that you've created up until this point. So for Danyelle, this label of bulldog, it really became this solidified, non-flexible narrative, this story of herself that she really had to fight against and control, specifically in the workplace. And then that kind of bled over into the other parts of her life too. Once we start to get into that mode of thinking, where we feel or think something that's uncomfortable, we typically do whatever we can to get away from it. Danyelle wanted to distance herself from this label of bulldog, for example. And in order to do so, she got into this pattern of overcompensating, of trying harder, of doing whatever she could to break free from those labels. And so as we move through our environment with these labels that other people sometimes tell us that we are, we can look back to that science and ask ourselves, based on what we know about how humans learn, can we in fact rewrite or change our thoughts directly? And the answer is no, we can't. Because of the fact that everything we learn becomes part of this larger web of understanding. You can almost think of it as like a giant spider web, but it's like huge and massive and 3D and like so incredibly complex. So trying to directly change our thoughts one by one is trying to undo a giant entangled sticky spider web. It just doesn't really work because everything we go about doing in our day can trigger us to think about or make these associations with things that we've learned in the past. So sometimes these labels, these things that are told about us or things we tell ourselves, they can actually be true, but sometimes they're not. The key thing is that if they aren't helpful, if these labels or descriptors of yourself aren't helpful, and if they don't speak to you in your value system, then it's something that we have to learn how to respond to in a way that does allow us to live more truly in line with what we care about most. So I just want to say this interview really was very impactful for me as I was having this conversation with Danyelle. I had a lot of epiphanies myself. And I want to share that I have some future plans for my coaching, specifically that service that I offer, because in the past I've served folks who wanted to seek habit change in kind of a variety of different areas of their life. But recently I've realized that this was a little bit too broad for me and that I really wanted to narrow down my focus. So I want to share this with you that I'm currently developing and thinking about what I want to hone in on in terms of my services. And I want to share that I'm really in this kind of development stage of that process. So hopefully you can kind of witness some of that as it unfolds and gets more clear. But I want to be open about this exploration with you and where it's going to lead me as a clinician. And one thing I know is that I'm really passionate about working with individuals who experience anxiety. That I've actually learned by the process of doing this podcast, actually. And I also want to work with people who actually feel disempowered, who struggle with self-identity and who experience these same outcomes of escape from these narratives of this kind of overcompensation, of burnout, and lack of mentorship from someone who understands them. And the reason that these things really stand out to me is because these are things that describe me in the past. And though I would say that I'm more flexible now and able to kind of navigate my life through these perspectives on myself, they still exist so very much in my internal world. And I've also learned that that's okay. And I've learned that these are skills that I need to then respond to in a way that lead me toward my goals and values and not away from. And so in this way, doing this work of self as context has taught me so much self-compassion. By doing this perspective taking, it's also illuminated my own values around what I care about, around the work that I want to do, and who I'm really passionate to serve. I want to say thank you to Danyelle. You've really ignited this passion in me. What I want to do from here is let's go ahead and go back into Danyelle's story and see kind of what she's talking about in terms of that really harsh feedback that happened early on in her career. What happened since then, and what has come out of doing some of this work of distancing herself from these rigid labels, stepping outside of the experiences and context, and seeing what some of the things that can come out of doing this work, what values show up for her, and how is she able to kind of move forward in her career with this new perspective so that she can live her life with a little bit more self-compassion and compassion for others.
What if one of your colleagues, whether they were upper level, your peer, a white colleague, what if they were to say, actually, I disagree with that feedback, and I think what you said was actually really offensive?
I think that's what needs to happen. I think that more, especially in this culture, like I'm still learning about cultures and being Black and I'm still learning. And so, but I think if we can kind of have this attitude of like, whoa, let's stop right here. That kind of rubbed me the wrong way. Let's have a discussion about it. Then I think that we can kind of start to break down some of these barriers, and we can start to break down these huge misunderstandings that can occur. And I think we can stop damaging each other. And I think that we can start kind of addressing some of these microaggressions that occur, some of these macro aggressions that occur. But I think that's exactly how we start, Gabby. I think that's a good place to start, is kind of all being responsible and accountable for what's being said, how information is being delivered, and just opening up the floor for those difficult discussions.
Yes. Yeah. Because I think maybe some of those things are said because of the fact that they may feel uncomfortable with some sort of cultural rule being broken in some way.
Yes.
And I don't think that's necessarily your or any person of color's responsibility so much as it's everyone's responsibility if there's something that is said or done that is offensive, no matter who you are.
Right.
I mean, people should stand up for one another. My son, he's 4. My husband asked him the other day, he said, Matthew, what is a boss? What is the definition of boss? And he said, a boss looks out for people.
Yeah.
And I was like, wow, that's beautiful.
Profound, right?
Should be, they should look out for you. They should care about your well-being, both
personally and professionally.
Yeah. And if you're not doing that basic thing, that a 4-year-old can articulate, then they're not doing their job. And it sounds like what you're doing right now with your mentorship, with your supervision, with you reaching out to people who aren't even your direct reports, that is looking out for people.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm really in the space of learning. I recognize the deficits that I've kind of accumulated over the course of my career, and I'm trying to fill in some of those holes. I think we really need to be creating things together. I think we need to, it's not Black people and it's not, non-Black people, but really how are we getting to the root of the problem? Because I don't want this to be temporary. I don't want this to be, because there is an injustice that we all, experience together. I really want to figure out ways to break down some of these systematic barriers and really cultivate effective change. And we're going to do that by really collaborating on core levels. And that means that I can work with Black people and I can work with white people and Asian people and Indian people, and that we're really talking about these things and cultivating these experiences really foundationally and not just at surface level.
Yeah. Yeah. And really meeting each other halfway, like finding a common ground.
Yeah.
But it doesn't have to be all one way or another.
Right.
We can all belong in the same space. It's just going to look different.
Yeah.
And it's not going to be the same as it used to be. So I hope that day, I see that day coming.
I'm hopeful for it. I really am. I mean, we have a long way to go, but I'm hopeful with some of the changes that I've seen and some of the responses that I've seen. But we still have a long way to go.
Yeah. And you're planting seeds and you are cultivating the future women, diverse, wonderful group of future leaders. So keep doing that work. And I will too. And I think just pointing out the fact that, we're both sitting here talking as women of color, different ages, different backgrounds. We can common ground, and we can also maybe possibly be a role model for someone else who might look just like us.
Absolutely.
Who same work. So
yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing your story. I know that you didn't necessarily tell a sequential story, but the story that
I'm sorry. I know that's one of my, I have so much to tell. I don't know how to organize it. So I apologize.
Wonderful. Because what I really wanted you to talk about was the story of this narrative that you're having to navigate through your career. And of course, the details are important too, that you've accomplished a lot, and you're, we're working and learning as a single mother, a woman of color. And those are amazing things to celebrate. I want you to quickly share what you're doing right now and how people can find out more about you.
Okay. So I established Loving Hands Family Support Services in 2015. And so our agency provides services really to people of color. We really want to serve Black and Brown communities, underserved populations. Not that we don't serve everyone, but really we, have a passion for serving underserved communities. In that, I am also providing coaching and mentorship and supervision. You mentioned that I was in school. I am finishing up my PsyD in clinical psychology. If everything goes well, I will be graduating in June. And I'm working on my dissertation, which is specifically research in Black women who live in America who experience trauma in their childhood. And that has kind of been the catalyst to get me to re-examine some of my own trauma, really look at these themes that Black women face in America, and really start to dissect kind of how that trauma affects them as women, as mothers, as professionals. And so that's the work I'm doing. I really want to be a beacon of light to young Black women. And I just want to continue to kind of build bridges so that we can continue kind of building up this community together.
Wonderful. Awesome. And how can people find you if they want to learn more about your mentorship?
So our website is www.lovinghandsca.com. I'm on Instagram, Loving Hands, on Facebook. Oh, and I also want to share a new project. I'm a part of this new community called Reveal. I'm working with a couple of other BCBAs, And we are creating a platform for women. We are really specializing in creating a community where women can come in and access encouragement, support. We have a whole bunch of fun, exciting stuff kind of coming. So if you're interested in that, that's reveal.community. And that's how I can be reached.
Cool. Oh, I can't wait to hear more about Reveal.
Yeah, it's really exciting stuff. We are developing a bunch of different platforms to meet everyone's needs. And really, it's just a place where women can come and gain access to resources that they wouldn't typically have access to. And again, this comes from this intense desire to provide information that wasn't always accessible to us as clinicians as we were coming up in the field. So that's really what our goal and our mission is.
Awesome. Good for you. I love that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. Love to your baby. Take care. And
Bye.
I will look forward to talking to you soon.
All right. Okay. I'll see you.
Bye.
Read it to Mama. Good girl. Yep. Bed. And the monkeys. Hi, monkey.
In this episode, you heard from Danyelle, a mother of two, an entrepreneur, a successful and experienced behavior analyst, and yet she is so much more than these labels. We learn from her story that we may have labels or descriptors or characteristics of ourselves, but they may not actually represent our values and the roles that we want to have in our lives. And if that's the case, rather than trying to escape or push away those different labels that have been shaped up over time, we can look at them, we can be self-aware, we can label them for what they are, and then also do the work of discovering what our values are in the process. We learned that by trying to escape from some of these different things, some of these narratives that we don't like about ourselves, we might actually end up costing ourselves in the long term. Whether it's that overcompensation, the trying harder, the burning ourselves out to prove ourselves. So when Danyelle was starting to be able to do some of this work on herself, she saw what her values were underneath that resistance to these labels, which was she really wanted to serve others. She really wanted to advocate for herself, to network, to collaborate, and also become a mentor for other women of color. Maybe you connected to her story and can look to something in your life where you can think of a time when you struggle with your own rigid narrative, your own label about who you are. What if someone else were to describe who you are? Maybe your mom, your dad, or even someone you don't really get along with. What are the labels that they would use to describe you? And would they match up with the characteristics or values that you have for yourself? If the answer is no, if they don't align, then ask yourself why. What in your history has reinforced those labels that people associate you with or that you think that they do? Do you carry those labels around with you? I know I do. And I know for myself, one of my big labels is introvert or shy. Especially my dad growing up, he used to tell me and retell me stories about my shyness as a little girl. And I've experienced some of those descriptors about myself through the own experiences, my own behaviors that I've engaged in my life. So it's not necessarily untrue, right? But at the same time, if you can just be aware, if you can recognize those labels for yourself, it can be this really great place to start. And from there, we can step back. And by doing so, we can have enough space to develop a sense of loving self-compassion, of distance, and of perspective.
I got all the strawberries. I got it. I got all the strawberry ice cream.
Mommy, eating strawberry.
I have a lot more to say about Danyelle's story and her struggles with prejudice, and how we can all support one another in the workplace. I recently wrote a blog about this, so please check that out on my website, actinspiredbehavior.com. There's so much more conversation to be had. And if you're interested in reaching out and telling your own story or would like to learn more through my blog, workshops, or coaching, Find me on Instagram at actinspiredbehavior, email me at gabby@actinspiredbehaviorcoaching.com, or use my link in the website listed in the show notes. I'd love to hear from you.
Mommy, can you pretend you were asleep?
I am asleep.
If this episode resonated with you, subscribe to this podcast and stay tuned for future episodes. And please take a moment to rate and even review this show. It is so helpful in getting others to find this show. Thank you.
Oh, who's poking me? Who is it?
Yeah, you got it!
2 of them? You know what? That's it.
Mom, you're laying on it.
You don't you come in here shooting me. And Daddy, you don't shoot me.
Hello again. I want to take a moment and say that this podcast is for educational purposes only. Content and conversation provided in this podcast should not be taken as or replace professional or therapeutic recommendations. As a board-certified behavior analyst, my goal is to disseminate ACT and behavior analysis to the wider public and have meaningful conversations to further explore our understanding. If you are concerned about your own personal well-being, I encourage you to seek out the help of a licensed professional who can provide individual support to you. Thank you so much.